Welcome to the July 23rd, 2019 replacement lecture for International Drugs and Politics, International Politics and Drugs, whichever it is, 145A at UCSD. In this video, we're going to be going through relatively quickly Federico Varese's Mafias on the Move. This should be a relatively quick lecture because there's not a lot of evidence in the chapters that I assigned to you to cover whether or not Varese is right. What's Varese's puzzle? Very simple. Under what circumstances can mafias migrate to new markets? If a mafia is like a business, under what circumstance will they establish a branch office somewhere else? The way that I just characterized the mafias here is going to be misleading to a question that I provide for you in the future, so just be aware that that was kind of a trick. All right, literature review. Before Varese came along, we had a majority view about when and how mafias would spread, which is that they would spread relatively easily. This is spurred on by a handful of characteristics of the global market for mafias. One is that we have globalization. There's an awful lot of goods, money, and people flowing back and forth. We are in a class about drugs. We know that the supply chains for drugs are oftentimes international, and if the supply chains for drugs are often international, why then the organizations that supply those drugs or protect those supply chains ought to be international as well. And so we should be setting up branch offices of our mafia wherever the business that we protect flows. A second reason that we might expect mafias to spread easily across borders is technology. Technology makes franchising and monitoring your agents overseas easier, right? Now it's your agents overseas are just a phone call away, and so especially today we should expect that mafias should spread relatively easily. Third, we have lowered language barriers. Everyone speaks some amount of English, and so for the same reasons that setting up a new business overseas is somewhat easier in a globalized economy, so too should setting up a new mafia business. Now, there's some amount of intuitive evidence that tends to support this view, right? We have a sense that Italian mafias spread throughout the United States and became influential, particularly during the Prohibition era and just after in the United States, in alcohol smuggling, drug smuggling, and gambling. In fact, we have some evidence that there are Italian mafias working all over the world. I guess maybe parts of Europe, Australia, and the United States and Canada is not all over the world, but you get the idea. There's been a fair amount of spread. And in general, this idea that mafias can offshore themselves relatively quickly and easily is consonant with this view that we kicked off the class with, which is that there's this sort of global syndicate of cooperative organized criminals working in different markets, cooperating on trafficking different products and helping each other ship these sorts of goods and launder the money that comes from shipping these sorts of goods. To the extent that you often read that these new criminal organizations are running ahead of antiquated state forms of governance in the same way that Google or Twitter run circles around dinosaurs like General Electric, right? The analogy that we see sometimes is that states look like, Rockefeller manufacturing companies where the new crime syndicate mafias look and smell a lot like really flexible service providing new economy Web 2.0 type organizations. Well, Varese thinks that this is kind of BS. He's going to write a book that supports a minority view, which argues that mafias face substantial challenges when they relocate. What might these challenges be? Well, the first challenge should be pretty straightforward for you now. The principal agent problem is exacerbated by distance. If you have a mafia member who has intelligence agents or street-level agents who are spread out in the small town or neighborhood in which the mafiosi operates, it's relatively easy to take a stroll and check up and make sure that they are where they're supposed to be at the right times. You probably have a fair amount of local intelligence about where you are on your own. It's how you became a mafioso in the first place. Not so if you send your agents overseas. Much, much harder to check up on them, much, much harder to put their performance into context. Going back to our lecture on hierarchy, the Miller lecture on hierarchy, much, much harder to view all parts of your supply chain when some of them are overseas in places you don't understand very well. So we have a straight up Shapiro problem. Distance makes it harder to monitor an employee. The agent can then misappropriate capital. In fact, here's a big problem, right? If the agent is captured or caught by the principal in this game, the agent might even inform on their bosses back home and rely on local law enforcement to provide them with protection. An example of this that Shapiro provides, even within the same countries, Italian mafias that invested in Las Vegas casinos as prohibition ended were constantly being screwed over by the agents that were operating the casinos, and they spent lots and lots and lots of money monitoring the financial performance of those casinos. A second problem is that corrupting officials in new markets is hard. You show up, you attempt to buy off your local customs agents or your local police officers to look the other way while your criminal businesses do their dirty deeds. And the police officers have no idea whether or not to respect your offer. Say that they're interested in being corrupt. They don't know if you're from internal affairs. They don't know whether you have the capacity to protect them or keep the honest cops off their back. They don't know whether you're going to renege on cooperation. You don't have any sort of an established relationship with law enforcement. You have to start co-opting your major competitor completely from scratch. And Varese argues that this presents a huge capital cost to starting a new mafia business in a new place. Relatedly, gathering intelligence about your competitors or about the businesses you're hoping to insure or anything else about your new market is also hard. You remember, the main advantage that a mafioso has over the state as a competitor is that they have better local intelligence. Well, if you just washed up on shore yesterday, you don't have better local intelligence than the police force where you're working, especially if there are corrupt police officers who are already corrupt, who are already working, violating their principal-agent arrangement with the state and ultimately the citizens to gather dirty information and use it. Those people are going to be miles and miles ahead of you. So here we see the way that Varese lays it out. Agents and bosses need to be in touch frequently. Face-to-face meetings would be the exception rather than the rule. So we have lots and lots of problems gathering evidence and communicating across borders. Fourth and lastly, your reputation for violence doesn't travel well. Why is a reputation for violence so important to a mafia? Well, if we remember both Scarbeck and Gambetta, a reputation for violence, the ability to engage in gruesome, grotesque violence from time to time, paradoxically decreases the amount of time you need to use violence and therefore drastically lowers your costs. Well, if no one in your new territory has ever seen you commit a gruesome act of violence, if no one in your new territory has ever been protected from a rival group of badasses by you, then there is no one to spread credible rumors, credible reviews, go on Mafia Yelp and leave you 5 stars to let anyone else know that you're not to be messed with. This occurs to the extent that one of the factors Varese thinks is important for mafia transplanting is whether or not there's been some form of advertisement, some form of publicity that establishes a particular gang as an international group of badasses. You may recall during the time that Donald Trump was fulminating and focusing on MS-13 that some gang experts alleged that Trump's repeated publicization of MS-13's wanton violence and its particular brutality or dangerousness aided its recruitment in the United States. Right? That in fact, hearing the president talk about these things made it possible for MS-13 to come here and establish themselves against local gangs more quickly because they already had this reputation that it would otherwise have been very expensive for them to establish. So, in general, then, we see that the costs and investments required to successfully move overseas or into a new territory as a mafia is substantial. So, what would we need to know in order to guess if these investments were worth it? Well, the rest of the theory is going to spell out these motivations, right? We need to understand what might motivate a mafia. Okay, so what model of mafia does Varese use? We should think about this before we argue about their motivations, right? The motivation of a networked group, a corporate group, and a statist group should be different from one another. So what model does Varese use? Earlier, I sort of made the analogy that these new, as the mafia spread, they were essentially establishing branches, which might have caused you to think that I was going to head to a corporate model. But in fact, Varese makes pretty explicit that these are groups that aspire to govern others by providing criminal protection. So we have a protection racket or state model of the type that's theorized more by Gambetta and Skarbek and less by Shapiro or Berman. So here are the steps to transfer as Varese sees it. First, you need to have a migration of the violence entrepreneur. You need to have someone, the mafioso, him or herself, or someone who works for them directly in some type of a franchise arrangement, needs to essentially be kicked out of the place where they already have a business arrangement. Sometimes the state does this, right? A mafioso who turned to becoming a state witness commented during his testimony that the policy of forced resettlement of mafiosi who were captured in the south of Italy was a good thing. It forced these mafia members to remake themselves as men of respect in new places, in new cities, particularly in the north. There's some amount of evidence that the mafia gangs that have been able to establish themselves in northern Italy, where the mafia is much less of a problem, have done so on the back of these state relocation problems. Other mafias might also do it. In certain circumstances, when you take over the territory of another mobster, it forces them to move. And the story of the Italian mafia arriving in the United States is often, at least in the beginning, a story of these mafiosi being displaced by their competitors in Italy. So it's interesting to think that, you know, the American mafia that we've come to see as being so ruthless in the Godfather movies were actually second cut. These were the JV squad. They got kicked out of Italy by the Italians, and so they come to run crime gangs in New York and Philadelphia and Boston, where there were substantial Italian populations. And in reality, these people were sort of second rate. I think by the second or third generation of mafia involvement in the United States, you have mafias in Italy recognizing that there are opportunities in the U.S. and they're actually sending people over to compete with the new American mafias. Okay, so once the violence entrepreneur arrives, they need to find a demand for protection that the state doesn't offer. What might give rise to such demand? Well, one thing might just be state failure, right? If the state is just absent, if there are places where the police don't protect you, you may find that there is a demand for a mafia. This is how the mafia started in southern Italy, according to Gambetta, right? The mafia protected legal industries because the state was so corrupt that the mafia provided you with a more efficient solution to informational asymmetries. Remember, Gambetta is all about how the mafia solves informational asymmetries. Another potential, well, I guess this is an example of this problem, right? In Piedmont. Piedmont is in northern Italy. It's a part of Italy that's typically seen as being well governed. But Piedmont saw an explosion of new construction and manufacturing industries for which the Piedmontese city was ill-equipped to manage disputes. You waited in line for years to go to court trials. And so, because the state failed to set up dispute resolution mechanisms capable of managing this explosive growth, there was a state failure that mafiosi could capitalize on. Another potential problem is that your police are super corrupt, right? And they've functioned to benefit the mafia before. Where the police are corrupt, you have an option to step in and replace them. And of course, the third opportunity arises when the state makes certain things illegal in the first place. Sex workers and their bosses and their customers can't litigate their disputes in court. You can't litigate the failed sale of or failed cocaine purchase in court. So you need protection rackets um, that can help you manage this problem. There's one final reason that we might have a demand for extra legal protection, and Varese plays with this for a while and then ultimately rejects the theory. It's the theory of social capital. Social capital refers to a bank of trust, essentially, that individuals who live in a society have in their neighbors and their government. Now, social capital, according to Tim Putnam, who we'll talk about a little bit more in a minute, arises from civic involvement. When you may actually recognize Tim Putnam's name from Bowling Alone, his argument that civic capital was on the decline in the United States, and so we're more likely to see the breakdown of American society. But civic capital arises when we have social groups. Everything from the official groups like the PTA to unofficial groups like bowling clubs and book clubs and these sorts of things get you out there, you meet members of your community, you get to know your local leadership, and as a result, you have some sort of trusting relationship with them that makes the local state really, really efficient. Varese rejects this ultimately, but let's take a little bit more of a look at why this is plausible in Italy, where Putnam first studied the concept. Here is a layout of where civic society, civilians in society, have the highest number of civic groups. We can see that, of course, the low numbers are clustered down here in the south, the least civic districts of Italy, whereas high civic capacity societies are clustered up here in the north. And so Putnam's big finding here is that this amount of civicness correlates pretty closely with institutional performance. The states do better up here than they do in the South, and this correlation is a major piece of evidence that Putnam is correct. We should see this correlation if Putnam's evidence is true, and he provides some regression analyses that show that the correlation between how civic your community is, how many organizations it has that provide social opportunities for its civilians, strongly correlated with how well the government performs. And we won't spend a lot of time going into the theory there. It's a very interesting book. But I will just point out that superficially, there appears to be this same north-south relationship, the same correlation. And we'll see up here that Piedmont is something of an outlier. It is one of the places that's had a mafia-related homicide, and it's seen as having a slightly higher mafia index than many of the other northern states. But Varese selects Piedmont out as an example of how mafia is successfully transplanted to the north and says, listen, Piedmont is relatively high in civic capital. And so the fact that the mafia was able to spread to Piedmont suggests that high civic capital isn't enough to fend mafias off. If you have these other opportunity structures available, civic capital won't keep them out. Well, Putnam might respond that Piedmont is something of an outlier in this relationship. Piedmont is a little bit different than other places, and so maybe Varese is cherry picking a little bit here. We can set that aside for the moment. A third thing that might facilitate the transfer of a mafia to a new state is the existence of a population similar to the violence entrepreneurs in the new place. Why is this helpful? Right, of course, if you're an Italian who washes up on the shores of New York and there's already an Italian community there, you have a group that speaks your language, you have a group that knows your reputation, so you don't need to build up your reputation or your local intelligence with the same intensity you would if you were, say, an Italian mobster who washed up on the shores of Vietnam. And second, you maybe have a group that's being alienated or abused by the state. When the Italians showed up, they were seen as second-class citizens. They distrusted the police. They were abused by the police. And so this creates its own demand for extra legal state protection or extra state protection. Another thing, obviously, we want there to be no pre-existing mafia. If there's a mafia already there, it's going to be costly to displace them. You're going to have someone who's already ahead of you in the game of local intelligence gathering, in building up a reputation for violence. So we may find that these If the startup costs to overcome that mafia are too high. The last one, the last step or reason that a mob might transfer, which Varese sees as being somewhat independent of the other four steps, is that there's some sort of unique asset the mafia needs to get access to be competitive in their home market that only exists in the place that they would like to expand to. Varese argues that this is really rare to see a mafia respond to the existence of an overseas asset by attempting to snap it up, and it's not strictly necessary for the mob to transplant itself to a new place. And the reason that this is a relatively rare circumstance is that each type of asset you might find overseas has a specific set of problems or risks that usually overwhelm its value. When you're looking for foreign laborers, when you're looking for specialists in some place that you need to hire or some new market you need to capture, the problem you face is that foreign laborers tend to sell you out to more local mafias. If your reputation for violence and your local intelligence is not as strong as a local mafia, then you essentially have this new principal agent problem that arises. The agent you hire gathers a bunch of intelligence on you and on your operation, and then they sell that intelligence out to a more local mafia because they think that they are going to get paid more and be protected better by the local mafia than they are by you. Here we sort of have an example of this. The Italians in the 1970s attempted to send someone here to work in competition with the most well-established American Italian mafias. Oops. The second problem is that it's usually more efficient to outsource capital assets to a specialist. So you can always hire someone, you can give them access only to the secrets in the organizational structure that they need to get the job done, and you can pay them relatively less than you would have to pay a full-time employee. So this slide just refers you to a summary of Varese's theory. We're going to end here. I'll leave you with a couple of discussion questions. What model of mafia does Varese use? How do we know that? Can you go back through the text and find the justifications for making the argument that Varese is using a state form of mafia? And especially, how might Varese's conclusions change if he was thinking more in terms of a corporatist or corporate-like mafia? Would that change the sorts of challenges that the mafia faces, and therefore the conclusions that he would come to? And then lastly, I think the major potential alternative to the statist mafia for Varese's theory would be a corporatist version. But would you think that a networked model of mafia could ever transplant? Or do they manage this problem of networking their way into a new country in a different way? Okay, thank you for playing along. Be sure to watch the companion lecture to this where we discuss a case study of La Familia Michoacan.